this class, our concern has largely been with the following question. What is the morally right thing to do? When you're faced with a difficult scenario, circumstance, one that tests your will to do that right thing, or one where there's a real clash of values and you just don't know what the right thing to do is, one of the fundamental questions of moral philosophy is, how do we determine the morally right course of action, and how do we know what the morally wrong course of action is that we should avoid? And this isn't really just a question that is particular to this class, that really is just the fundamental question of moral philosophy itself. Philosophers are very much concerned with how should we act. And another way to put that is, philosophers are concerned with normative questions about our actions and about ethics. But there's another question that I'm going to look at in this video, which, while technically speaking, isn't really strictly philosophical. It's really a psychological question. It's a question of moral psychology. And it's the question not so much of what is the right thing to do, but how do we make decisions about what is the right thing to do? When human beings are faced with a difficult ethical choice, what is it about us that determines what we will do? Is it a sort of strict, abstract reasoning process? Is it some sort of innate feeling we have or emotion? Is it just some sort of gut reaction that we have when faced with that scenario? What is it about us that determines the ethical and moral decisions that we make? And before diving into the details of this question, I want to just say a few things about why you should care about this question, which I'll return to at the end of the video. So, the main reasons you should care about this question is because ideally, we would like to think that as a society, as a human species, as a country, as a state, whatever the case may be, as a group of human beings, it would be possible to converge on what the right moral principles are and what the right thing to do is morally. We would like to think that we could come to agreement, at least at some point through discussion, about how to best live a human life and what the right thing to do is on a whole host of very difficult ethical issues, such as the death penalty or abortion or anything else that really separates and divides people. Now, the one thing I want to suggest is that if that is a goal that we have, to be able to reach agreement and convergence on difficult ethical issues, then we really do need to be concerned with how do people make their ethical choices? What leads people to have the beliefs they have on those very divisive and controversial moral issues? Because once you understand that, that's going to tell you, well, how can I best convince someone who doesn't agree with me? Once you understand moral psychology, that will better tell you or enable you to figure out why is it that certain people disagree with me? And what is the best route for me to go if I want to appeal to them and bring them to my side? So moral psychology really is important, not just in our everyday lives for understanding ourselves, but also for understanding other people, and hopefully for our ability to build a more cohesive, more caring, and more well-ordered society. In order to better understand this question of how is it that we make our moral decisions, and how is it that we determine our ethical beliefs, let's keep in mind one specific case that we've looked at previously in this class. So here I have a description of the Vlasovic case. You will recall that here we had two individuals, Peter and Dora Vlasovic, whose mother who was 67 years old, and they were really unable to support her any further, so they wanted to enroll her in a nursing home. She was steadfastly against a nursing home and said, in fact, she would rather have an end to her life than to enter a home, as she called it. Now, of course, when we looked at this case, we said there's all sorts of competing values and considerations. There's all sorts of competing stakeholders and interests, and there's not clear what would be the right thing to do, or at least we have to think carefully about it. But of course, if we look at this case a little further, and if we ask ourselves, how is it that we come to believe what the right thing to do is in this case, it may not be necessarily a matter of reasoning. In fact, as we're going to see in this lesson, the idea that what determines our moral beliefs and what makes us believe what we do about morality is a matter of reasoning is just one view of several different views you could have on this question of moral psychology. Now in this video, we're going to look at two different types of views about what causes us to make moral decisions in cases like the Vlasovic case or any other ethical dilemma you might come across in this class or in life in general. One approach that many philosophers have taken and many moral psychologists have taken is to say that what causes people to make their moral decisions is reason. That ethics fundamentally is determined by our reasoning processes, right? When we're faced with a difficult ethical decision, we sort of take an objective stance, we look at all the stakeholders, we consider all the different arguments, and based on that intentional reasoning process, that is what causes us to have the beliefs that we ultimately come to have. So that's one sort of view. On the other hand, there is a view that's more based on intuition or feeling. According to this view, reasoning may have a role, which we'll be talking about, but primarily when you come across a difficult ethical case, whether it's the Vlasovic case, any other case we've talked about this in class, a discussion on the death penalty or abortion or drug use or any other controversial moral issue, according to the intuitionist view, what makes you think the way you do about what is right and wrong on those issues is a sort of immediate intuition, feeling, or gut reaction you have. The reason you think the way you do about abortion, the death penalty, or illicit drug use isn't because necessarily you've thought carefully about the issue, although maybe you have, but primarily what is driving your decision is some sort of basic gut level reaction, some basic intuition you have, and that is what's driving you. And according to the intuitionist school, then the reason we see so much moral disagreement, the reason we see so much controversy over difficult ethical cases is just because people have different feelings. People have different intuitions. And so, in a sense, we are destined to run into conflict. Now, those are the two broad different positions you could take, and we're going to look at each one in a little more detail. And in particular, we're going to look at some evidence for the intuitionist view later in this video. But first, let's get a little better handle on the sort of reasoning position. And specifically, I'm going to call this position ethical rationalism. So what is ethical rationalism? It holds that ethical decisions result from a process of reasoning. Specifically, we make ethical judgments through considering the reasons for and against a certain course of action. So if rationalism is true, then as a description of human psychology, this is what happens when you're confronted with a difficult ethical dilemma. So first, a case like the Vlasovic case is put toward you. You're confronting this ethical dilemma. You're thinking about what to do. Then you engage in ethical reasoning, right? Once you've confronted the case, then you say, well, here are the different courses of action. I'm going to consider the reasons for and against each of them. And you say that whichever of those courses of action has the best reasons to support it, that's the one I will support and believe is best. And so then third, on the basis of that reasoning process, then you form what we'll call an ethical judgment, which is just a decision about what should be done. Okay, now, like I said, many philosophers have held this view. They've held that what makes human beings special is our ability to reason. And they've even said that if we didn't have this reasoning ability, that essentially morality or ethics would be impossible. That ethics is so much a product of our reasoning ability that the very presence of terms like good or bad or right and wrong, that's all predicated on the fact that we have the ability to think through different courses of action and think about what are the best reasons for what we ought to do. There's a sense in which the ethical rationalist view is quite appealing, because if ethics really is a matter of reasoning, then we can hold out hope that we can convince others through providing the best arguments. Right? If someone you think has a wrong-headed view about an ethical stance, if you think they have the incorrect view, then you can say, well, look, that's okay if we just both discuss with one another and we put out our best arguments, we'll both be able to see what the best reasons are, and we'll be able to converge on what the best course of action is. And of course, that's very hopeful because that seems to provide a very nice path forward for society when we can all come together through rational discussion. Of course, if you've ever really been in a discussion with another person you disagreed with, about abortion or the death penalty or drug use or euthanasia or any of the other very controversial ethical issues people may talk about, then you might think that all sounds a little naive. Because instead of seeing rational argument, we usually see people holding fast to their positions, refusing to let go, and not necessarily listening to points being made that might undermine what they've said. And for this reason, a number of moral psychologists have said something else is going on here. Does reasoning play a role? Yes, but there's something more fundamental that is driving us when we make a moral decision. And this other view I'm going to call ethical intuitionism. So what does intuitionism hold? It says ethical decisions result from an immediate intuition, feeling, or reaction we experience that does not result from any process of reasoning. So when we think about the concept of intuition, we're saying this is just something that I know immediately or I'm immediately aware of. I don't know it because or believe it because I've reasoned through it or thought through it. It's just sort of immediately there. And at least the intuitions we're going to be talking about are really just immediate feelings or sort of gut level reactions. Okay, so according to ethical intuitionism, how does moral decision making work? And let's contrast it with the rationalist view. Well, once again, we're confronted with some sort of ethical dilemma, right? Then we consider the dilemma, we think about what to do, but instead of on the rationalist position, we see that reasoning comes next. On the intuitionist view, what comes next is not a process of reasoning. What comes next is we consider the dilemma and then we immediately feel some sort of feeling or intuition or gut reaction, and that determines our decision. The important point is that for the intuitionist, what you believe about that dilemma is already determined at step 2. Your gut initial reaction is what is going to determine what you believe. Now, what is the role of reasoning? I mean, because in class we've put these cases forth and everyone in class has discussed what they believe is the best thing to do and has given reasons for their view. So certainly reasoning plays a role, right? Well, it does, but it actually comes last. And what ethical reasoning does is, or what it is a search for reasons that confirm your intuition, right? You confront the dilemma, you have an immediate intuition or reaction which determines what you think is right or wrong. And then after that, you say, well, now I'm going to find some reasons that confirm what I already believe. The reasons aren't determining your belief. You're not believing what you believe because of those reasons. You're just saying to yourself, well, I believe this thing, now I need to find the reasons to support it. And to be very clear, ethical intuitionists don't say this is going on consciously, right? They're not saying that you're actually saying these things to yourselves. This is really just an unconscious process we're not aware of. We're just out in the world, we're making judgments, we're feeling these intuitions, we feel very strongly about our feelings and gut level reactions to ethical dilemmas, and so we want to support those by finding reasons that confirm what we already believe. So this is the ethical intuitionist view, and you can see how it's very much contrasted from the rationalist view. Now, to give some evidence of this, I want to look at some of the cases that have been considered by the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. Because so far we have these two different views, but you might say, well, why should I believe one over the other? Well, psychologists have actually done studies and research on this, and they have set them up in a way so as to determine what is making our decisions, reason or feeling. So let's look at one of the cases that Haidt mentions. So here's this case. Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They're traveling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night they're staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide that it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy making love, but they decide not to do it again. They kept that night as a special secret, which makes them feel even closer to each other. What do you think about that? Was it okay for them to make love? Now, a couple things about this case. First, it was a scenario that he posed to individuals that were participants in his study. And second, it's obviously carefully designed to touch on some very powerful taboos in our society. Specifically, taboos about brother and sister, family members having sex with one another. But in any case, it is an ethical dilemma. The question is asked, do you think it was okay for Julie and Mark to do that? So we have the ethical dilemma. Now notice the way Haidt describes how the reactions of the participants occurred to that dilemma. So he tells us most people who hear the above story immediately say that it was wrong for the siblings to make love. And of course, I don't know anything, about what your particular reaction is, but I would be willing to bet that that very likely was your immediate reaction. Your immediate reaction to that probably very likely was, yes, it would be wrong of Mark and Julie to do that, and you may have even felt certain feelings of disgust or certain feelings of aversion to even the thought of them doing that. But notice, and before we continue on, notice how, in some sense, this is in line with the ethical intuitionist view. You're confronted with an ethical dilemma, and then immediately you have a feeling or intuition that determines what your belief about that case is going to be. And then Haidt continues on. And then, after they had already had that reaction, then they begin searching for reasons. That is, they begin searching for reasons that confirm their initial intuition. They point out the dangers of inbreeding, only to remember that Julie and Mark used two forms of birth control. They argue that Julie and Mark will be hurt, perhaps emotionally, even though the story makes it clear that no harm befell them. So the story was carefully constructed so that any of the harms of incest in this case, right, any of those harms would be essentially brushed aside. Right, there's no danger of inbreeding or offspring, or at least there's no reasonable danger when two forms of birth control are being used. Anything's possible, but in this case, it wouldn't be reasonable to think that was a likely scenario. Also, there's not going to be any emotional harm. As stipulated in the story, none of that occurred. And so he says, eventually many people say something like, I don't know, I can't explain it, I just know it's wrong. And that's really the crucial quote. I can't explain why I believe this, but I still know it's wrong. So think about that. And you've probably had that experience. You might be having it right now as you think about the Julie and Mark case. As you think about the fact that perhaps the reasons that immediately come to your mind for why it's wrong, as you consider the fact that those ultimately fail, you might just be falling back on this idea that I just know this is wrong and I don't need an argument to tell me it's wrong. But if you believe that that's the case, then what is sort of driving your moral belief? What is driving your moral belief is the intuition or feeling that you already had about cases like this prior to even hearing it. It's not any reasoned argument. And Jonathan Haidt has used other cases of this sort to make the exact same point. So he talks about another study which examined American and Brazilian responses to actions that were offensive yet harmless, such as eating one's pet dog, cleaning one's toilet with a national flag, or eating a chicken carcass one has just used for masturbation. The stories were carefully constructed once again so that no plausible harm could be found, and most participants directly stated that nobody was hurt by the actions in question. So again, we have some rather eccentric, odd, and maybe offensive actions here that are posed as an ethical dilemma, but again, for which those actions do not harm anyone. And that's important, because if they did harm anyone, you might have an argument against them. You might say, you shouldn't do that because it harms people. But if we stipulate that no one's harmed, then we find we're still left with the intuition it's wrong, we have to wonder why. So again, what did the participants say? Participants still usually said the actions were wrong and universally wrong. They frequently made statements such as, it's just wrong to have sex with a chicken. So that's the intuition. It's just wrong to use a chicken carcass in that way. It is just wrong to use the flag of your country in that way. These things are just wrong. It's a feeling or intuition I have. And then you think about the role of ethical reasoning. And what Haidt has noticed in his research is that whatever reasons you can come up with for your positions, they are much worse predictors of what you will believe than, again, your initial emotional response. Haidt said their effective reactions to the stories were better predictors of their moral judgments than were claims about the harmful consequences. Haidt found the same thing when they interviewed conservatives and liberals about sexual morality issues, including homosexuality, incest, and unusual forms of masturbation. For both groups, affective, that means felt reactions, were good predictors of judgment, whereas perceptions of harmfulness were not. They also found that participants were often morally dumbfounded. That is, they would stutter, laugh, and express surprise at their inability to find supporting reasons, yet they would not change their initial judgments of condemnation. So this all speaks to the fact that reasoning isn't really what's doing the work in our moral judgments. If we find ourselves sticking to a moral judgment despite being completely, and even to our own surprise and laughter, unable to find reasons for that judgment, then the feeling and intuition must really be doing the work. Now, of course, all this brings up the question of, well, where do these intuitions come from, right? If so much of our ethics is really a product of intuition, we really should be concerned about how do we get these intuitions? And I think there's various different sources they might have, some personal to you and many will be shared by others. There will be certain innate psychological dispositions we have as a human species, maybe that have been given to us by evolution through natural selection. This in part might explain the sort of immediate disgust we have towards incest because, of course, of the harmful consequences it can have in reproduction, even though in this particular case, of course, that wasn't a concern. Sometimes our ethical intuitions can be based on personal experiences. If you had a traumatic event in your past around some certain action or event, you might have a real personal disgust or aversion to it. Depending on what your sort of community is you've been brought up in, what's your upbringing like, what's your religious traditions, what are your social customs, all those might give you certain aversions and feelings about certain practices that won't necessarily be understood or be shared by people from different social customs and traditions. And finally, the author of our textbook, Lisa Newton, also notes that our capacity for empathy sometimes leads us to have these basic sort of intuitions and feelings that come prior to any argument. She asks, what triggers the emotional reaction? Neuroscientists cite the amygdala above and what are called mirror neurons that lead us to feel pain when we see others suffering. So another feeling we have is just this, and this is why we might say that cruelty, right? The ability to be cruel to another person and mean-spirited to another person for no personal gain of your own is something that maybe we hate as being morally wrong more than anything. And you might say, well, why is that? Why do we have that basic sort of feeling? Well, it might come from our ability to put ourselves in the place of another person and to feel the pain of other people. And of course, you can give good reasons for why being mean-spirited and being cruel and being oppressive, you can give good reasons for why those are bad things. But fundamentally, it could be the case that what really leads us to believe those are bad is this sort of pro-social feeling we get, this empathy we have for people who are suffering. So in any case, we can see that our intuitions come from many different sources, some personal, some social, some universal to the human species, but in any case, all these intuitions operate prior to and independent of ethical reasoning. Now, in order to further understand the role that intuitions and feelings play in our ethical decisions, I want to look at a very famous philosophical thought experiment, which is known as the Trolley Problem. And the Trolley Problem is used in all sorts of ways, sometimes as a way of thinking more clearly about certain issues in applied ethics, but I really want to use it as a test case to ask ourselves the question again, what is determining what we think about this very odd situation? Now, the Trolley Problem is really multiple problems. There's different versions, and each of these versions tends to elicit a different response when people hear it. So we're going to start with one version of the trolley problem, which I'm going to call the switch. So here is the situation. You are a switchman controlling which track the trolley will take, right? So in this case, what we have is this sort of runaway trolley. It has no driver, and there's no way for it possibly to stop, or maybe if there is a driver and the brakes are shot, you can sort of describe the case as you like. But all that really matters is we have a runaway trolley. And as the description says, in this case, you are the switchman. You are this person on the side of the track over here. Now you have two options. One, you can do absolutely nothing. And if you do absolutely nothing, notice what is right in front of the trolley. Right in front of the trolley is a group of 5 people all tied up to the tracks, looking very nervously at that trolley, hoping you will pull the lever. Because, of course, if you do pull the lever, then you will divert the trolley. It'll go on the other track. And, of course, it is unfortunate that over there we do also see one person tied to the tracks, very much hoping that you will not pull the lever. So that is the dilemma in the switch case. Do you pull the switch and cause the one person to die, or do you do nothing and allow the 5 individuals to die? Now, of course, the thing to notice here is that you do, of course, have an opportunity to save a net total of 4 lives. If you pull the switch, yes, 1 person will die, but 5 will be saved. Okay, now let's compare the switch to a second case, which is usually called the fat man. Another very odd scenario. So here, just as before, we have this runaway trolley, and as you can see, nothing will stop the trolley, and in front of it are 5 people tied to the tracks. But in this case, instead of being off to the side and operating a switch, you are actually on a bridge that is over the tracks. And you're not the only person up there. There's also this fat man up there, and is a man so large that although he is large enough to stop a runaway trolley in its tracks if he's in front of it, he's not so large that you're not able to push him over. You can fill out the details exactly how you want of how that would be possible. But in any case, now here is your dilemma. You can either do nothing, in which case, once again, the 5 people on the tracks will meet their demise, or you can push the fat man off the bridge, pushing him to his death, but he will act as a blockade to the trolley and stop it in its tracks, saving the lives of the 5 people tied to the tracks. Okay, now as I said, there have been all sorts of uses of the trolley problem scenarios. But for our purposes, what I want to look at first is how do most people respond? There obviously is no universal response. Every time I ask this question to a class, there will always be people on every side of both scenarios. But there is a pretty common current of the most common reaction that people tend to have. So, and studies and research on this have shown that in the switch case, most people will say that you should pull the switch. You should save the 5 lives, even though it will mean sacrificing 1 life. You should pull the switch and save those 5 lives, even though the 1 person will die. In the fat man case, however, most people would say you should not push the man off the bridge. Even though doing so would save the 5 people, even though it would save a net of 4 total lives, most people say it is morally wrong to push the man off the bridge to stop the trolley, even though it's okay to pull the switch. Now, this is a very interesting point because we should notice that the same basic structure is in place in both of them. In both cases, either you can do nothing, in which case 5 people will die, or you can do something. That means pull the switch or push the man, and you can save the 5 people tied to the tracks. The choice is, in a sense, in both cases, the choice is in your hands. And in both cases, the stakes are exactly the same. So what is it that causes people to see a difference here? What is it that causes people to say, yes, you should pull the switch, but no, you should not push the man off the bridge? So our current question is, why do we see this difference between the switch case and the fat man case? And there have been a number of suggestions posed by philosophers that are supposed to give a theoretical basis for why these 2 cases are different and explain what I'm calling the common response. Again, the common response being that it's okay to flip the switch, not okay to push the man. For instance, some people say that the reason for this common response is that, well, in the case of the switch, you're not intending the death of that 1 person. That 1 person's death on the sidetrack is really just a side effect, it's just collateral damage. What you're intending to do is save the 5 people, and sometimes when we intend to do a good thing, we have to accept some amount of collateral damage, or we have to accept some bad unintended side effects. And maybe that's right. But of course, why can't we say the same thing about the Fat Man case? Why can't we say that the individual's intention was to save the 5 lives, and it's a regrettable and foreseeable but very unfortunate side effect that the man had to die by being pushed off the bridge? If we can say the death of the one person tied to the track in the switch case was unintentional, why can't we also say that the death of the man being pushed off the bridge was also unintentional and a side effect of just saving the 5 lives? In addition, some people have suggested that the reason for this difference is because of a fundamental moral principle and moral prohibition against doing harm. Right? It's always wrong to directly do harm to someone. And this explains why it's wrong to push the man off the bridge. Well, fine, maybe that's the case. Maybe there is some sort of inviolable moral command that we must not do harm. But then we can go back to the switch case and just say, well, how are we not doing harm to the one person that's tied on the track when we flip the switch? There's much more to say about these sort of rational justifications for why there's a difference between the cases. But what I want to point out here is that I don't think either of those explanations are really what is going on in people's heads when they encounter this scenario. I think what's much more likely, and as Lisa Newton explains in our textbook, what's much more likely to be the explanation of the different reactions to these cases is, as she explains, the very different mental portrayals of the act of sacrificing 1 to save 5. In the first, we only have to deal with an inanimate switch, which we can do. In the second, we have to assault a very heavy man, struggle with him, he may be tempted to assault back, and the whole episode of flesh on struggling flesh is highly disagreeable. Right? Really put yourself in the situation of the person on the bridge. What do you have to do to save those 5 people? You literally have to manhandle another human being and force him to his death. And that's a much more aversive and really disgusting act from an emotional point of view than simply flipping a switch, even if the outcome is the same. And she points to another example. Look, most soldiers, for instance, would rather kill the enemy with drones than bayonets, although the death is just the same in either case. We don't just have a sort of negative reaction to people dying or bad consequences. We have a negative reaction as to how those outcomes occur. And if we have to be heavily involved in literally causing someone, another human being, to die, that is something that's going to be, again, highly disagreeable on an emotional point of view. And this idea that that's really what's going on here is actually, again, supported by research. So here I'm going to cite some research that was done by the social psychologist Joshua Green. And he echoes what Newton is saying. He says the thought of pushing someone to his death is, we propose, more emotionally salient than the thought of hitting a switch that will cause a trolley to produce similar consequences. And it's the emotional response that accounts for people's tendency to treat these cases differently. Now, how does he know this? Well, one of the things Green did was he had participants who were responding to these cases actually hooked up to an fMRI machine, which is essentially just a brain scan machine. So when you have a subject doing a certain activity or engaged in some response to a case or a prompt, it will show you what areas of their brain are active and lighting up. And here is what Green ultimately found. He said in moral personal cases, which is just the general category he gave to cases like the Fat Man case, where it has a moral relevance and you have to be personally involved in the bad outcome, fMRI scans have shown that medial portions of Brodmann's areas, BA9 and 10, medial front gyrus, BA31, posterior cingulate gyrus, and BA39, angular gyrus bilateral, and that's just some fancy medical talk for all the portions of the brain that really control emotion. All of those portions of the brain were significantly more active in the moral personal condition, like the Fat Man case, than in the moral impersonal, such as the switch case. And again, recent functioning imaging studies have associated each of these areas with emotion. So what does this mean? That means when you're confronted with the switch case, your brain is much more likely to be operating in a rational and reason-based manner. You're much more likely to say, look, well, the consequences are I can save 5 lives or I can save 1. Somebody has to die. There's no avoiding death. Therefore, the best course of action is to pull the switch and sacrifice the 1 to save the 5. When you are confronted with the switch case, that is the way you think. But when you're confronted with the fat man case, you think very differently. You don't think in those same terms, even though you could apply the same argument. Even though in the fat man case, you could say, look, somebody has to die. I might as well save as many lives as I can, therefore I should push the fat man off the bridge. You don't think in that manner at all. You think in an emotional way. The emotion centers of your brain are very active and would light up on an fMRI scan. And so what does this fundamentally show? This shows in some cases where we have to be really personally involved and personally invested, we are not primarily in ethics thinking with our reasoning capacities. Instead, we are largely on the level of intuition, feeling, and gut level reaction. Now, to conclude this video, I want to say a few final things about, again, why any of this should matter to us. Why should we care about moral psychology? Why should we care about the fact that much of our ethical decisions could be based on emotion, intuition, and feeling? Well, in order to think about this, I want you to again imagine you're having an ethical debate with someone on a controversial ethical issue like abortion, death penalty, euthanasia, drug use, about which you disagree. Now, you put yourself in that situation, imagine yourself getting in a heated argument, and imagine the sort of thoughts you might be feeling and thinking when this person simply won't see your side of the question and won't agree with you. You might say, well, is this person just fundamentally confused about ethics? Do they have the wrong values? Are they just too dumb or stupid to see it the way I'm seeing it? Can they not reason correctly? And likewise, you might say, well, look, if I've given a perfectly reasonable argument that I find convincing, and many people I know find convincing, then there must be something wrong with this person when they hear the same argument and they don't see it my way. That's a very natural reaction. I think it's quite common. It's a quite common sort of phenomena when there's disagreement about controversial ethical issues. What I'm going to suggest, however, in this video is that that is not necessarily the approach we should take, and specifically, if the intuitionist view is right, and if feeling and intuition really lie at the bottom of our ethical disagreements, then an entirely different approach is more appropriate. First, if you want to convince someone, just hitting them over the head with rational argument and reason after reason isn't necessarily going to be the most effective. You have to appeal to them on an emotional level. But I think even beyond that, because I don't think we should always be so concerned about making sure that everyone around us always agrees with us. Even beyond that, I think this can help us sort of get away from the mindset that would see people who disagree with us as having to be either stupid or evil. Because fundamentally, if our ethical decisions are based on intuition and feeling, and the sources of those intuitions and feelings might be particular to us, it might be something about our psychology, it might be something about how we were raised, and which all might be very different from how the person we're arguing with is constructed and how they were raised and their circumstances in life. If that's really what's at the bottom of this disagreement, then the reason the person doesn't see it your way isn't because they're evil or don't understand ethics or don't have the right values or can't reason. It's because they just have different intuitions. And I think that means, on a practical point of view, what we should really try to do when confronted with disagreement is not immediately condemn, is not immediately find ourselves in the middle of the either stupid or evil dichotomy. Rather, what we should try to do is understand each other. We should try to understand what led the other person to think the way they do. Why do they have the sort of gut level feelings and reactions they do? Why do I have the ones I have? And try to see things from their point of view. And even if this ultimately doesn't lead to convergence on what is the ethically right thing to do in this case, I think it still has some very important practical benefits. It allows us to take a more empathetic, more caring, more concerned, and ultimately kinder look on our fellow human beings. And in my view at least, I think that's always a positive outcome. In any case, I will stop there. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.